Hey everyone, welcome to this video where I'm just going to be quickly recapping a game that I played into Dromai. We're going to be using the aggro version of Dash today, so the boost aggro list. This is going to be mainly built off of the hybrid version. So we're going to be running the more aggressive side of the deck. But more importantly, we're going to choose to start with Induction Chamber rather than Teklovossen. The main reason is because eventually the Dromai player can start full blocking you if they want to. A lot of their invokes are block 3s for the dragons, which then means you can sometimes be in a spot where you'll eventually be at risk to fatigue. And Induction Chamber is just a nice way to start to apply some pressure out of the blues when you start to hit the bottom of your deck. We're not trying to run the full pistol version because it's a little too slow into Dromai, but it is a nice way to try to balance some of that risk that you can have to fatigue. And also because it's a very easy way to have dragon control, just simply blocking down to maybe a blue and then just attacking 2 dragons or attacking 1 dragon twice is more than enough. So our turn is just going to be maximizing some value, but we opt to use the blue zipper hit, mainly because we'd rather arsenal the yellow 0 to 60. And we choose to boost the zipper hit here because we want that final shot out of the pistol. We end up losing a pounder, but that's okay. We end up drawing another, but that's like not really relevant to like the reason why we chose to play out that line. And here our opponent decides to not block, to simply throw down dragons, try to establish their board state. Dromai and Yenderai are both pretty difficult to deal with. Dromai not so much, but Yenderai is tough, being essentially at 6 health. Although we can shoot it with the pistol, give it go again, and then just attack it with a 3 attack if we care about keeping the board clear. Which at this point with our opponent at this high of a life total shouldn't be our main priority. We're not really looking to ignore dragons unless our opponent is extremely low, and you need to be much more careful. So we choose to block the Chroma here. Our turn is going to be looking to be a little bit slower. Now that our opponent decides not to attack with, oh wait, no, I'm sorry. Okay, I'm confused. They had an action point from Chromai, and so they were able to attack with the Senpai and then attack with the Yenderai. So blocking with the Red Throttle there was the best use of the card. But now we're left with pretty much no attacks, and we still need to be able to kill the Chromai. But we decide to let it stay on the table for 1 turn just because there's not really much else we could do. Although I think that there's maybe an argument that we should have used the 0 to 60 that's an arsenal. But I did want it to be on the more aggressive side. But I think leaving Chromai at this stage in the game is probably not the best use of our cards. So I think that there is an argument that we should have used the card in Arsenal to clear the Chromai. And that way our opponent's left with no Ash, but needs to still find a way to generate it as well as play a dragon, because now we've just put them in a spot where they could just attack with Chromai, gain an action point, and play a Senpai. And we just took another 3 damage that we probably could have avoided. But I think we are looking for a pivot turn, because using the pistol just to shoot Chromai at the very end is normally a much better use of our cards. But the problem is we just drew into an all red hand here. So there's really no way for us to, I guess, sort of effectively use the cards that we have. And now our opponent plays Command and Conquer. So the problem is that if we block for 6, the opponent gets to keep Chromai for another turn. And then just goes back to a misplay that we made much earlier, which should have been just to use the 0 to 60 to attack the Chromai. But if we only block with, but what we choose to do is block with no cards. We lose the arsenal, we take the 6 damage, and that way we can pitch a red to at least clear the Chromai off the table and then get to arsenal one of the other cards. But there was still a misplay there that I think happened 2 turns earlier by just not killing the Chromai immediately. But the upside is that we were able to make the most out of a pretty bad hand. And now, of course, because of variance, we drew an all red hand. So now our blue count, like the chances of drawing an all blue hand go up a little bit. And so now we get hit with like a really dense blue count in this hand. So we also have to find a way to kind of make our way out of this hand as well, because there are some problems here, of course. Our opponent plays Mirror Guy, removing Phantasm from the dragons. We don't care about blocking for the 2 damage here. We would rather find a way to use the cards in other ways. And now our opponent comes in for 6, which is definitely pretty difficult. The cards in our hand don't do too much, but we do have Combustible Couriers, which means that we can use them to attack the dragons and hit them. But the problem is we don't have any like actual boost cards to follow up with. So assuming that combustible courier hits, there's no other boost card in the hand to actually get the plus effect from. So like we're just in a really bad spot with these like last couple hands. They just perfectly don't line up in the way that we want them to. Because the problem is like we can use a combustible courier and like manipulate the fact that our opponent is playing Dromai, because we can hit the dragon, have the on hit, but the problem is the only other card in our hand that has boosts that would get the +3 from combustible courier is another combustible courier. So then the next one gets to hit, but then there's no other boost card after that to get the plus effect from. So we're like just in the worst spot possible, and that's why we have induction chambers. So you just saw there, we were able to, off of a blue, clear a full dragon off the table because we had induction chamber. So that was a very big reason for why we choose to still include that card when playing this matchup, even though we're still on a more aggressive version of the deck. So our opponent is pitching to play Uvia. Uvia is difficult for us, but not super difficult in this version. If we're on the pistol version, this card is a nightmare because it's very difficult for us to kill the Uvia, and it's very difficult for us to deal with all the Ashwings it creates. But in the aggro version of the deck, the card is not that great. At least it takes way too long to get the full value from it, and we're normally able to kind of steamroll our opponent at that point. Now we have a much stronger hand because we do have Combustible Courier, and at least we have a boost card that we can actually get something from. Our opponent throws Command and Conquer, so we opt to use our Crown of Providence now, and we actually get rewarded really, really well by drawing a 0 to 60. So now we just have like an incredible turn here, given the chance that we're able to utilize it effectively. So we manipulate the fact our opponent has dragons, so we send the Combustible Courier for 6 with the Tekla Pounder at Uvia, which then means that our 0 to 60 gets +3 from the Combustible Courier hitting. We boost that card. And then, so 0 to 60 comes in for 7, which is really good. And now we're trying to look to pivot a little bit. We have been kind of losing at this point in terms of turn cycles because of the fact that we just drew like 2 hands in a row that just blanked and did nothing. And we also misplayed by letting that Chromai stay on the table a turn longer than it should have. And we really took a lot of unnecessary damage from that. We should be a little bit higher right now. Our opponent should be a little bit more behind, but because of that small misplay, we just got set back way too far. And we just opt to clear things off the table, which is probably the best thing to do here. It's sort of like playing against Prism, you know? But we then just decide to throw the payload, even though it doesn't have Dominate, because if we get 2 cards from our opponent, we're probably in a pretty okay spot here, especially because I'm starting to read that our opponent is opting not to block to try to be more aggressive with the dragons. So at that point, I am sort of interested in just throwing out a vanilla 6 with no Dominate, because I had a feeling that my opponent wouldn't even full block it, even if they were given the opportunity to. I think if our opponent was trying to fatigue us as aggro dash, it would have happened much earlier. They would have been full blocking rather than taking all the damage. Like if our opponent was actively trying to fatigue us, I don't think it would be a 26 currently, but we've also taken a lot. Like if we slip up on 1 to 2 more hands, there's a very good chance that we actually lose here. And now we're able to still utilize the induction chamber pretty effectively in this matchup, thanks to just the fact that there are ways to use it. So in most versions of this deck where you're going to be running the aggro package, not in terms of like matchup spread, you're going to be wanting to start with Tekla Pounder, but this is like a small exception where there's normally a lot of flexibility with having the induction chamber, and because Dromai is a much more mid-range style list, you can start to get a lot of value out of just having that card in the field to start the game with. And so looking at this hand, we have some lines that we've talked about before on the channel where we can break Goliath Gauntlet here, use Zipper Hit, and then play Payload, and the Payload has Dominate for 8. So with the 1 charge left on Tekla Pounder, that's a hand that now comes in for 15 damage, which is more than enough to kill our opponent here. So just keeping a blue, we're able to be a little bit more flexible with that yellow Zipper Hit, but we can also just decide not to block at all. But our opponent plays Kyloria, which is kind of an issue here for us, so we are going to have to block, unfortunately, but it is fine with us because we can block with that yellow Zipper Hit, block with the Tekla Foundry Heart, and be perfectly fine. Our opponent is just building out their board state to go as wide as possible. hopefully trying to swing tempo. And we are in a rough spot here because if our next stand doesn't really do something super effective, we are going to be pretty much on the back foot for the rest of the game and lose because our opponent has a board state currently. Some other lines we could do are blocking down and maybe just pitching the blue overloop to maybe just boost the red zipper hit, and then attack a couple dragons with the pistol plus the induction chamber. We could clear the endurance counter off of Yenderai, kill Kyloria, or I can kill Kyloria, throw an attack at Azulai, because that one's also very difficult, but we choose to pop it to immediately end their turn instead, because of the Phantasm effect removing the go again from the dragons. So I was just clarifying that with my opponent. They choose to attack with Azulai first, which means Kyloria never gets to come in to threaten an on-hit. But now we're in a weirder spot here because now we don't have the payload, but it means that we can actively boost our zipper hits and then use Teklovossen Heart and get enough resources to still use the pistol plus induction chamber this turn if we want to, or we can boost with the zipper hit, pistol our opponent's dragons, and then arsenal the yellow zipper hit and hope to draw into maybe Overblast or High Octane. So those are two considerations. But since my opponent just blocked with Counter Providence to not go to a super low range, I can just sort of, I understand that there are probably cards that they want to keep in hand. So then I start to pressure their hand instead and choose not to arsenal here. And so here we activate Teklovossen Heart to get all those resources back. So that way we can pistol out a few dragons. And so now we're in a tough spot here because we can either pistol our opponent or we can maybe kill an Ashwing. And at 11, with 3 cards on our opponent's hand, there are definitely lines where they can threaten lethal on us, but at 4, it starts to get really, really difficult for our opponent. So I pressure their life total instead. If they had used Footsteps to maybe block an earlier attack, then I would choose to attack the Ashwing, because whenever the chain would close, Phantasmal Footsteps can always block the pistol for 1. So Induction Chamber does have some limitations in this matchup because of that, but I still like to run it anyway because you'll see these games will normally grind out very, very long. It's like that with most Illusionist matchups, unfortunately, even through Phantasmal Footsteps. So looking at this hand, we have a really fantastic line where we can either shut down their turn by blocking with Throttle, which is what we're considering doing, because we don't know what that last card in our opponent's hand is. If we kill the Ashwing with a Throttle, they have no way to give it go again. And our turn is still okay because we can pitch a blue, play High Speed Impact, and then pistol a couple times using the Teklovossen Heart. And we get punished for it because we're forced to block anyway, but our hand is pretty good if we're able to use the Teklo Core to pitch, because we can play High Speed Impact. And then we can also play Throttle with the Goliath Gauntlet on top of it, which is going to threaten a lot of damage from our opponent and probably require them to lose their entire hand. But that's, I mean, we'd go to 1 here, which I think is maybe a little bit too risky. I think we could have been fine blocking with the Throttle, but I think we wanted to drop our opponent super low and then be able to pitch out with the blue Throttle to attack our opponent's life total as well. Because assuming that our opponent drops to 1, Phantasmal Footsteps is not enough. And even here, if we pistol twice, our opponent can't resort to just using Phantasmal Footsteps because they're still dead here, because the Phantasmal Footsteps will block for 1, and then they'll block for 1, which means that our opponent is still dead, which is a lethal line here. So we were able to get lethal this turn, just barely. There was a lot of room for error there. There's a lot of ways that could have slipped up entirely, and I think it was kind of risky for us to ignore some of the dragons at some stages in the game. But regardless, hopefully this video was helpful. Thank you for watching.